at 19. Clara Whitmore buried the grandmother who had raised her, and before the flowers from the funeral had even begun to wilt, her own relatives sold the family ranch without asking her. With nowhere she truly belonged and barely enough money to start over, Clara discovered one final paper Evelyn had left behind: the right to take ownership of a remote Montana sheep ranch called Black Pine for just $10. Everyone thought she was making a terrible mistake. The ranch was isolated, the fences were failing, winter was closing in, and wolves had already left tracks near the pasture. But Clara paid the $10 anyway, packed everything she had into an old pickup, and drove there with her dog, Finn. Then Finn began acting strangely. Every morning, he pulled toward the same section of forest beyond the north fence. One snowy afternoon, Clara finally followed him through the pines and found an abandoned shed nearly swallowed by brush. Inside, beneath decades of dust, Finn led her to an old ledger and a stack of photographs. Clara opened the first page and saw her grandmother's name beside a payment that should have been impossible. But what Evelyn had done to save Black Pine was something Clara's family had never told her. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are. And if you enjoy emotional stories about family secrets, forgotten places, and second chances, subscribe to the channel. Now, let's return to the day Clara buried her grandmother and discovered her family had already sold her home. The last guests had barely left Evelyn Whitmore's funeral when Clara learned the ranch was no longer theirs. She was standing in her grandmother's kitchen, still wearing the black dress she had borrowed for the service, when Robert placed a folder on the table. Finn lay beneath Evelyn's old chair, his head resting between his paws. "What's this?" Clara asked. Robert exchanged a glance with Hannah. "The sale agreement." Clara stared at him. "Sale of what?" Neither answered quickly enough. Her stomach tightened. "The ranch, Clara," Hannah began. "We were going to explain. You sold Grandma's ranch?" Robert pulled out a chair. "The property has been losing money. Taxes, repairs, equipment, none of us can justify keeping it." "When did you decide this?" "We've been discussing it for weeks." Clara looked toward the window above the sink. Beyond it were the barn where Evelyn had taught her to bottle feed orphaned lambs, the fence Clara had helped repair at 15, and the cottonwood where they buried an old sheepdog years ago. Grandma was still alive weeks ago. Robert's expression hardened with discomfort. "She was very sick. Did she agree to sell? The estate arrangements gave us authority to handle the property." Clara pushed the folder away. "That wasn't my question." Hannah touched her arm, but Clara stepped back. "Why didn't anyone ask me?" Robert sighed. "Because you're 19. So, you don't have the money to operate a ranch. Keeping it because you're attached to it wouldn't be responsible. I worked here. That isn't the same as owning it." The words struck harder than Clara expected. Finn rose and pressed against her leg. Clara rested a hand on his neck. "When do the buyers take possession?" 5 days. 5 days. Evelyn had been buried that morning, and in 5 days, strangers would own the kitchen where Clara had eaten breakfast through most of her childhood. "You should have told me. We're telling you now, after you signed." Robert said nothing. Clara swallowed. Maybe selling was the right decision. Maybe I couldn't have saved it. But I should have been allowed to say something before it was gone. She left before either could answer. Upstairs. Evelyn's room still smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. On the dresser sat a small cardboard document box with Clara's name written across the lid in Evelyn's handwriting. Clara carried it to the bed. Inside were photographs, insurance papers, old receipts, and an envelope marked "For Clara." Her hands trembled as she opened it. Most of the contents were ordinary records: but beneath them lay a yellowed property document. Black Pine Sheep Ranch, Silver Creek, Montana. Clara frowned. She had heard Evelyn mention Black Pine only a few times. Attached to the property description was a transfer option naming Clara as the designated recipient. The consideration amount stopped her. $10? That can't be right. Ann lifted his head at the words Black Pine. His ears rose, and he came to the bed, sniffing the paper before looking toward the door. Clara remembered Evelyn sometimes taking Finn on drives without explaining where they went. "You know that name?" Finn's tail struck the floor once. Clara turned another page. Black Pine was remote, old, and apparently still connected to Evelyn. Whatever condition it was in. $10 was less than Clara had spent filling her truck that week. Footsteps sounded downstairs as Robert and Hannah began discussing what still needed to be removed before the buyers arrived. Clara looked around Evelyn's bedroom. She could not stop them from selling this ranch. She could not make 19 years old suddenly seem old enough in their eyes. But Evelyn had placed something else in her hands. At the bottom of the envelope, Clara found a folded note. Only one sentence was written inside. She read it twice, then a third time as tears blurred the ink. "If they decide for you again, Black Pine is yours to decide." The next morning, Clara drove into Silver Creek with Evelyn's document box on the passenger seat and Finn curled behind her. The county office occupied a brick building beside the courthouse, and Clara spent nearly an hour waiting while a clerk examined the Black Pine paperwork. She expected someone to tell her the $10 transfer was an old joke or an expired arrangement. Instead, the clerk returned with additional records. "The option is valid," she said. Evelyn maintained the property and kept the transfer provision active. Clara touched the $10 bill inside her wallet. "So, if I sign this, it becomes mine? Subject to the recorded terms." "Yes." "For $10? The clerk smiled faintly. "For $10. Clara signed before fear could become an argument. When the clerk handed her the completed paperwork and receipt, Clara stared at them. Yesterday, relatives had decided she was too young to have a voice in one ranch. Today, she owned another. Black Pine lay well beyond Silver Creek, where pavement narrowed into a rough county road and finally into packed dirt. Mountains rose beneath a gray Montana sky. Patches of old snow remained in shaded places. Finn became restless as they approached the property, standing with his paws against the window. "You really have been here before, haven't you?" Clara asked. His tail moved. The ranch appeared beyond a weathered wooden sign, Black Pine. A small cabin stood near a sheep barn, surrounded by open pasture and dark forest. Several fence sections leaned badly. Clara parked and sat silently. It was not beautiful in the comforting way Evelyn's ranch had been. It looked cold, isolated, and neglected. $10, she whispered. Maybe Robert was right about my decision-making. Finn jumped out when she opened the door. The cabin smelled dusty but dry. An old wood stove occupied one corner. The plumbing worked reluctantly after Clara opened the main valve, and electricity still reached the property. Those small victories felt enormous. A truck approached before she finished unloading. The driver was a lean man in a canvas jacket who introduced himself as Cole Mercer. "You Clara Whitmore? Depends who's asking. The guy who's been helping keep your grandmother's sheep alive." Clara blinked. "There are sheep," Cole pointed toward his truck. "Small group. Evelyn had an arrangement with a neighboring ranch when Black Pine stopped being used regularly. I was told ownership transferred today." Clara had inherited more responsibility than the paperwork suggested. Cole explained that the sheep could be brought back gradually, but Black Pine needed immediate work. "Winter's coming early." "It's not even winter yet. Montana doesn't care about calendars. They walked the property together. Cole showed her the barn, water trough, hay storage, and damaged fencing. Clara recognized enough ranch work to understand the problem. The place was manageable only if she moved quickly. Along the northern pasture, several posts leaned outward, and wire sagged almost to the ground. Clara touched one weathered post. Beneath years of exposure was a faded stripe of blue paint. Cole stopped beside her. "Haven't seen that marking in years." "What is it?" Evelyn used blue paint on posts she repaired herself. Clara looked along the fence. More faded blue marks appeared at intervals. Her grandmother had worked here, not simply owned it on paper. Clara felt the same uncomfortable question she had felt when Finn reacted to the ranch's name. Why had Evelyn never told her more? Cole crouched near a broken section. "This needs fixing before livestock comes back." "How long?" "Depends how much help you accept." Clara heard the implication. "I know ranch work." "I didn't say you didn't. Robert thinks 19 means useless. I'm not Robert." She looked at him. Cole stood. "I'm saying Winter doesn't care whether you prove anything by yourself." Clara glanced toward the darkening mountains. "I'll start tomorrow. Start today." They temporarily secured the worst section before sunset. Cole promised to arrange the first sheep transfer once the enclosure was safe, after his truck disappeared. Clara fed Finn and carried her bags into the cabin. The temperature fell quickly. She started the wood stove, ate a sandwich standing at the counter, then walked outside for one final fence check. Finn stayed close. Near the north pasture, he suddenly stopped. His body stiffened. Clara followed his stare toward the forest. "What is it, Finn?" Lowered his nose and pulled toward the fence. In the thin snow beyond the damaged section, several tracks crossed between the trees. They were broad, deep, and larger than any dog prints Clara expected to find there. Headlights appeared behind her. Cole had returned for a tool he had forgotten. He walked over, followed Clara's gaze, and crouched beside the tracks. "Coyotes?" Clara asked. Cole studied them for several seconds before standing. "No." He looked toward the dark timber beyond the fence. "Wolves." Clara slept badly. Every creak of the cabin became something moving outside, and twice Finn lifted his head toward the north windows. By dawn, a thin layer of fresh snow covered Black Pine. Clara pulled on Evelyn's old work gloves and walked the northern fence before breakfast. The wolf tracks were still visible, though no new ones crossed the pasture. Cole arrived soon after with fencing supplies. "First rule," he said, examining the tracks. "Wolves belong out there. Our job is making sure the sheep stay protected in here." Clara appreciated that he did not turn the animals into monsters. They spent the morning tightening wire, replacing 2 damaged posts, and closing gaps near the barn enclosure. Cole explained that the sheep should be brought into the protected area every evening. Feed should never be left where predators could smell it, and Clara needed to check the perimeter daily. "I can handle that." "Good, because the weather's turning." By afternoon, the first small group of Evelyn's sheep arrived from the neighboring ranch. Clara felt unexpectedly nervous as they stepped from the trailer. Finn immediately became focused, waiting for her command instead of charging forward. "Easy," Clara told him. Together they guided the sheep toward the barn enclosure. The familiar rhythm hurt. Evelyn had taught Clara how to move livestock without frightening them, how to watch the flock instead of one animal, how to recognize trouble before it became obvious. For several minutes, Clara could almost hear her grandmother correcting her from behind. Then she remembered the sold ranch and felt the absence all over again. "You okay?" Cole asked. "Yeah." He waited. Clara sighed. "No, but the sheep don't care." "They rarely do." That earned a small smile. The next 2 days settled into hard routine. Clara fed before sunrise. inspected fencing, cleaned the barn, checked water, and worked through a list of winter preparations Cole had left her. At night, she brought every sheep inside the safer enclosure. Once, she found tracks along the outer pasture again, but nothing crossed the reinforced fence. Finn, however, developed another concern. Each morning he stopped near the northern boundary and stared toward the timber. At first, Clara assumed he smelled wolves. Then she noticed he always focused farther west than the tracks. "No," she told him when he pulled toward the trees. "You stay where I can see you." Finn obeyed reluctantly. The following morning, Clara found him sniffing one of the old, blue-marked posts Evelyn had repaired. He moved along the fence, nose low, then stopped beside a narrow opening almost hidden by brush. Clara called him back. Finn returned, but kept looking over his shoulder. "What is your problem?" His tail moved once. That afternoon, the sky darkened earlier than expected. Cole had warned her about incoming snow, so Clara hurried to stack hay under cover. When she finished, Finn was gone. Clara checked the barn. Nothing. She ran toward the cabin, then saw paw prints leading north. Finn's fear sharpened immediately. Wolves were somewhere beyond that fence. Clara grabbed her coat and followed his tracks through the opening beside the brush. The forest swallowed the ranch within minutes. Snow began falling in small, dry flakes. Finn-A bark answered from ahead. Clara pushed through low branches until she found him standing beside an old trail. "You scared me half to death." She reached for his collar, but Finn backed away and trotted farther along the trail. "Absolutely not," another bark. Clara followed only because leaving him was worse. The trail curved behind a stand of black pines. There, almost completely hidden by overgrown brush, stood a small wooden shed. Its roof sagged under dead branches. One wall leaned slightly inward. Finn ran directly to the door and began sniffing beneath it. Clara stopped. She had walked Black Pine's visible buildings with Cole. Neither had mentioned this place. "So this is what you wanted?" Finn scratched once at the threshold. The door would not open at first. Clara cleared branches away, planted one boot against the frame, and pulled. Wood groaned. The door shifted several inches before catching against something inside. Cold air carried the smell of dust, old timber, and rusted metal through the gap. Snow thickened behind her. Clara should have returned to the ranch immediately. Instead, she switched on her phone flashlight and pushed her arm through the opening. Shelves lined one wall. Boxes sat beneath a workbench. Old ranch tools hung from nails. Then her light crossed a photograph pinned above the bench. Clara stopped moving. No way. She forced the door another few inches and squeezed inside while Finn waited at the opening. Clara brushed dust from the photograph. A young woman stood in front of the Black Pine barn, one hand resting on a fence post painted bright blue. Her hair was dark, her face thinner, but Clara knew those eyes. She had seen them every day of her childhood. Written beneath the photograph in faded ink were two words: Evelyn Whitmore. Clara stared at the smiling young woman. Her grandmother had not merely visited Black Pine, she had belonged here. Clara waited until morning to return to the shed. Snow had fallen steadily through the night, and she refused to risk wandering into the timber again after dark. Before leaving the cabin, she fed the sheep, checked the water trough, and walked the northern fence with Finn close beside her. No fresh wolf tracks crossed into the pasture. Cole arrived while she was replacing hay in the barn. "You look like you didn't sleep." "Finn found something yesterday." Clara told him about the shed and showed him the photograph she had carefully brought back. Cole studied the young Evelyn standing beside the blue-painted fence post. "That's definitely Black Pine. You knew she worked here. I knew she owned it. That's different. Clara slipped the photograph into her coat. I'm going back. Fence first. A gust rattled the barn doors, as if agreeing with him. Overnight wind had loosened another northern section, and one post leaned dangerously toward the pasture. Clara wanted to ignore it. The shed had waited decades. Somehow waiting another hour felt impossible. Then she looked at the sheep crowded near the barn and remembered the tracks outside the fence. Fine. She and Cole reset the post and tightened the wire. By the time they finished, Clara's gloves were wet and her fingers ached from cold. Now she asked. Cole glanced toward the sky. Weather gives you a couple hours. Clara took Finn and followed the hidden trail. At the shed, she forced the swollen door open farther than before. Daylight revealed shelves packed with rusted tools, old feed sacks, cracked jars, and cardboard boxes damaged by damp. She worked slowly, afraid careless handling would destroy whatever Evelyn had left. Finn sniffed beneath the workbench while Clara opened the first surviving box. It contained receipts and livestock tags. The second held photographs. Evelyn appeared in many of them, feeding lambs, repairing fence, standing beside ranch workers Clara did not recognize. She looked younger than Clara remembered her, but unmistakably confident. Why didn't you tell me? Clara whispered. Finn nudged her knee. Beneath the photographs lay an object wrapped tightly in stained oilcloth. Clara lifted it onto the workbench and unfolded the covering. Inside was a thick ledger with worn corners. The first pages recorded dates, sheep numbers, feed purchases, fuel, veterinary costs, and equipment repairs. Clara recognized Evelyn's handwriting immediately. She had seen the same precise letters on grocery lists her entire childhood. As Clara moved deeper into the ledger, the numbers became harder to understand. Expenses rose sharply. Livestock counts dropped. Several pages contained references to overdue payments. One line had been underlined twice. Banknote, final date. Clara's stomach tightened. She turned another page. Evelyn's initials appeared beside a payment. Then again 2 weeks later. And again beside feed purchases. E.W. Personal Funds. Clara read aloud. Finn looked up. The amounts were not enormous by modern standards, but the dates told Clara they had represented serious money then. She photographed several pages before continuing. A gust struck the shed, making the roof creak. Clara checked the time. She needed to return before the weather worsened. Still, one photograph protruding from between two ledger pages caught her attention. She pulled it free. Evelyn stood outside a bank in Silver Creek wearing a heavy coat and holding an envelope. On the back, someone had written a date. Clara compared it with the ledger. Same week as the entry marked banknote final date. Footsteps crunched outside. Clara stiffened until Cole appeared in the doorway. Snow's picking up. She handed him the ledger. Look at this. Cole scanned several pages. These are operating records. Grandma was putting in her own money. Looks like it. Clara showed him the bank photograph. Why? Cole studied it, but shook his head. A picture can't tell us that. Robert always talked like Grandma just kept things organized. This looks bigger. Maybe, but don't decide the story before you have the records. Clara knew he was right. She closed the ledger and wrapped it again. They hurried back toward the ranch as snow thickened. Halfway there, Finn suddenly pulled toward the pasture. Clara followed his gaze and saw the problem immediately. The fence section they had repaired that morning was still standing, but another section farther west had collapsed beneath a fallen branch. Seriously, Clara muttered. They spent the next hour dragging the branch clear and making a temporary repair while daylight faded. By the time Clara reached the cabin, the ledger felt heavier under her arm than when she found it. She fed Finn, checked the sheep one last time, then sat at the kitchen table and examined the photographed pages. One entry kept drawing her back. E.W. Personal Funds, Emergency Note Payment. Clara compared the amount with months of recorded ranch expenses. It was far too large to look casual. Then she placed the photograph of Evelyn outside the Silver Creek Bank beside it. Her grandmother had been there during the exact week Black Pine faced an urgent payment. Clara stared at Evelyn's younger face and wondered where that money had come from. Clara called Robert after morning chores. When the sheep were fed and Finn had finally stopped pacing near the door, she placed Evelyn's ledger on the kitchen table before dialing, as if having it in front of her might prevent Robert from dismissing what she had found. "How much do you know about Black Pine?" she asked when he answered. "Not much more than I told you. Did you know it almost went bankrupt?" Robert paused. "Years ago, yes. Who saved it?" "Your grandfather and some of the men in the family dealt with the bank." "Why?" Clara opened the ledger. "What did Grandma do?" "Evelyn kept the books. She was good with numbers. That's all, as far as I know." Clara read him the entry marked E.W. Personal Funds, Emergency Note Payment. Robert went quiet. "Where did you get that?" "From Grandma's ledger." "What ledger?" "The one Finn found in an abandoned shed at Black Pine." Robert exhaled sharply. "Clara, you're upset about the ranch sale. Don't turn some old bookkeeping into a family drama because of that." Her fingers tightened around the phone. "I'm asking a question, and I answered it. The family nearly lost Black Pine. Your grandfather handled the bank situation." "Then why does Grandma's money appear beside the emergency payment?" "I don't know. I wasn't running the ranch then." Clara looked at the photograph of Evelyn outside the Silver Creek Bank. Exactly. She ended the call before anger pulled her into another argument. Cole had mentioned a retired bookkeeper named Margaret Hale, who had worked for the local agricultural cooperative during Black Pine's active years. Clara found her number and called. Margaret agreed to meet that afternoon. Before leaving, Clara checked the north fence. Overnight wind had loosened the temporary repair beneath the fallen branch. She spent 40 minutes tightening it, while Finn watched the timber. The mystery could wait. The sheep could not. Margaret lived in a small house outside Silver Creek. She was 71, silver-haired, and direct enough to make Clara immediately comfortable. Clara placed the ledger, photographs, and her phone images of the shed records on Margaret's dining table. Margaret put on her glasses and turned several pages without speaking. Then her expression changed. "That's Evelyn's handwriting. You knew her very well." Margaret touched one entry. "She did bookkeeping for the cooperative." Clara leaned forward. "Robert said she only kept Black Pine's books." Only Margaret gave a dry laugh. "Your grandmother worked evenings after ranch chores, sometimes late enough that I had to tell her to go home." She studied the figures. "These references here are cooperative transactions. Feed, transport, shared equipment. And these personal payments, they appeared to be Evelyn's. But appearance isn't proof." Clara felt her excitement falter. "The ledger isn't enough. A private ledger tells us what Evelyn recorded. To establish what actually happened, we need matching receipts, cooperative records, perhaps bank references, if any survived." Margaret examined the photograph taken outside the bank. "Do you recognize this date?" Clara pointed to the ledger. "Same week as the final banknote deadline?" Margaret nodded, but refused to speculate. "Then we verify." They spent the next hour comparing names and transaction codes. Margaret recognized several old ranch families and explained that bad winters often forced neighbors to share equipment or feed arrangements. One code beside Evelyn's initials made her stop. "I remember this account series." She pulled a notebook from a cabinet and wrote down the reference. "The Historical Society received some cooperative records when the office closed, if the relevant box survived. This number should lead us somewhere." Somewhere meaning what? Whether Evelyn's payment actually entered the ranch account? Clara returned to Black Pine before dark. Cole was checking the sheep near the barn. She told him what Margaret had said while they secured the animals for the night. "So Robert was wrong?" Cole asked. "Maybe," Clara caught herself. "Margaret says I don't know that yet." Cole smiled. "I like Margaret already." The next morning, Margaret called while Clara was carrying hay. "I found the cooperative reference." Clara dropped the bale and pulled off one glove. "What does it say?" "It confirms Evelyn was doing paid bookkeeping during that period. There's more." Paper rustled over the phone. "A transaction reference in her ledger matches an archived payment record tied to Black Pine's emergency debt." Clara sat on the edge of the haystack. "Whose payment?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Evelyn's?" "The record identifies it as personal funds deposited toward the emergency note." Clara looked across the pasture toward the hidden shed beyond the trees. Her grandmother had not merely been standing beside the people who saved Black Pine. Evelyn had put her own money between the ranch and bankruptcy. By noon, the sky over Black Pine had turned the flat gray Cole had warned Clara about. Margaret arrived before the snow, carrying photocopies from the cooperative archive in a thick envelope. Clara cleared the kitchen table and placed Evelyn's ledger beside them. "Start here," Margaret said, pointing to the winter when Black Pine's finances began collapsing. The record showed livestock losses first. Then feed prices climbed while income fell. A loan payment approached with too little cash in the ranch account to cover it. They were running out of time. Clara said, "And options," Margaret replied. Together they matched cooperative records to Evelyn's handwritten entries. Evelyn had reduced feed expenses, delayed purchases, arranged shared transportation, and worked evenings doing bookkeeping. Her wages appeared repeatedly as deposits toward Black Pine's expenses. She was working another job to keep this place running. Yes, Clara thought of Robert saying Evelyn had only kept the books, as though numbers had been a small task performed safely behind a desk. The records showed something different. Evelyn had been holding together every dollar while the ranch slipped toward failure. Margaret turned to the emergency payment they had confirmed. This stopped the immediate default, but her bookkeeping wages couldn't have covered that. They didn't. Margaret showed Clara another reference attached to the deposit. It identified proceeds from a private transaction belonging to Evelyn personally. "Can we find out what she sold, possibly? But not from this record alone." A hard gust struck the cabin. Finn rose from beside the stove. Snow had begun moving sideways past the window. Clara looked toward the barn. "I need to get the sheep ready." Margaret packed the papers. The records waited this long. Clara called Cole. He was already on his way. By the time he arrived, snow was covering the pasture. Clara had moved feed inside and checked the water, but the northern fence worried her. "We bring everything into the protected enclosure early," Cole said. "Then reinforce the weak section before visibility gets worse. I can handle the fence. You take the sheep." "Or we both do both jobs faster," Clara almost refused automatically. She wanted Black Pine to prove Robert wrong. She wanted nobody to be able to say a 19-year-old girl had survived only because someone else ran the ranch for her. "Evelyn managed storms here," she said. Cole pulled on his gloves. "Evelyn also called neighbors when she needed them." Clara looked at him. "How do you know people around Silver Creek remember?" Snow collected in Finn's coat as he waited for instructions. Clara finally nodded. "Fine." Together, Finn helped turn the sheep toward the barn enclosure while Clara and Cole worked the sides. One ewe resisted and broke toward the pasture, but Finn circled wide and guided her back without panic. Once the flock was secure, Clara and Cole carried posts and wire north. The wind made every task harder. Clara held the damaged fence while Cole reinforced it. Then they switched when his fingers became too stiff to work the fasteners. By late afternoon, the repair held. Back inside,
Clara made coffee while Finn slept, exhausted, beside the stove. "Thanks," she told Cole. "You don't have to sound disappointed about it."
"I'm practicing." He smiled. Clara looked at Evelyn's ledger. "I keep thinking if I need help, then maybe Robert was right. Maybe I'm not capable of this." Cole followed her gaze. "Your grandmother nearly lost Black Pine. Does that mean she wasn't capable?" "No." "Then stop using a rule for yourself you wouldn't use for her." After Cole left, Margaret called. She had traced the reference attached to Evelyn's emergency deposit through an older property record. "I found the transaction," she said. Clara sat down immediately. "What did she sell?" "I want you to understand something first. This property wasn't part of Black Pine. It wasn't ranch equipment or livestock. It belonged to Evelyn separately." Clara opened the ledger to the emergency payment. How did she get it? Inheritance. Margaret explained that the asset had passed directly to Evelyn from her own family. She had legal ownership independent of Black Pine. Shortly before the emergency note came due, Evelyn sold it. Days later, the money appeared in the ranch account. Clara stared at her grandmother's initials beside the payment. So she gave up her own inheritance to save the ranch. That is what the records indicate. Outside, wind drove snow against the windows while Black Pine's sheep remained protected in the barn. Clara had spent days asking where Evelyn found enough money to stop the ranch from failing. Now she had the answer. Her grandmother had not discovered money. She had sacrificed something that belonged only to her. The storm weakened before dawn, leaving Black Pine buried beneath fresh snow. Clara checked the barn first. Every sheep was accounted for. The water had not frozen, and the reinforced northern fence still stood. Finn bounded through the snow beside her, then stopped suddenly and stared toward the timber. Clara followed his gaze. Tracks crossed the white ground beyond the outer fence. Several sets. Wolves had passed during the night. Close enough that Clara could see where one had paused near the tree line. None had entered the pasture. The fence did its job. Cole said when he arrived, and getting the sheep in early helped. Clara looked at him. Our fence did its job. Saying "our" no longer felt like surrender. Later, Margaret brought copies of additional records she had found. Clara spread them beside Evelyn's ledger and photographs. The sale of Evelyn's inherited property matched the emergency payment almost exactly. But the photographs showed something the numbers had not. In one, Evelyn stood beside 3 neighboring ranchers unloading hay. In another, several people repaired the barn roof. A third showed women preparing food beside trucks while men stacked feed behind them. I thought Grandma saved Black Pine by giving up her inheritance, Clara said. Margaret shook her head gently. That bought time. It didn't do everything. She pointed to cooperative entries showing deferred transport charges, shared equipment, discounted feed, and labor exchanges. Evelyn knew how to ask people to stand with her. Clara studied the photographs. All week she had imagined her grandmother enduring the crisis alone, sacrificing her own money because nobody else would. That version of Evelyn had felt familiar. It was also wrong. She needed them. Of course she did. Nobody ever talks about that. Margaret smiled. Family like stories, with one strong person in the middle. Real life is usually crowded. After Margaret left, Clara carried the ledger toward the shed. Finn followed. She wanted to inspect the remaining pages before more snow sealed the trail. Near the north pasture, Finn stopped again. His ears rose. A gray shape moved briefly between distant trees. Then another. Wolves. They remained beyond the fence, watching the livestock from the timber. Clara did not approach them. She backed toward the barn and called Cole. They're near the north pasture. Bring the sheep into the protected enclosure now. I'm coming. This time, Clara did not say she could handle it alone. Bring extra wire. The west section looked weak this morning. Finn worked carefully as Clara gathered the flock. By the time Cole arrived, the sheep were inside. But one western section of fence had sagged under snow, and a loosened post. They cleared it, reset the post, and reinforced the wire before dark. The wolves never crossed the boundary. When they finished, Clara's arms shook from cold and exhaustion. "You called before it became an emergency," Cole said. "Try not to sound shocked. I'm proud of your personal growth." She threw a glove at him. He laughed and tossed it back. Inside the cabin, Clara warmed her hands beside the stove while Finn slept. She opened the ledger again. Near the later pages, Black Pine's numbers slowly improved. Debt decreased, livestock stabilized, Evelyn's emergency contributions became smaller, then stopped. Clara turned another page and found a folded sheet tucked against the binding. The handwriting was Evelyn's. The first lines described payments already recorded, but near the bottom, Evelyn had written something less like bookkeeping and more like a reminder to herself. Saving a place doesn't mean doing it alone. Clara read it twice. She thought of Cole in the storm, Margaret searching archives, neighboring ranchers and Evelyn's photographs, and her own fear that accepting help somehow proved she did not deserve Black Pine. Evelyn had never lived by that rule. Clara carefully returned the note to the ledger. Behind it, another page had been folded inward and nearly missed. She opened it. The entries were dated after Black Pine had recovered financially. There were fewer sheep, fewer expenses, and no urgent bank notices. At the bottom was a paragraph rather than a financial entry. Evelyn had written about offers to sell Black Pine once its debts were under control. Clara leaned closer. The first sentences explained why Evelyn had refused. Then one final line referenced a future transfer and the reason the ranch should remain available rather than be sold. Clara stopped. The $10 option had not been an afterthought created when Evelyn grew old. She had decided long ago that Black Pine needed to remain in the family for a specific reason. For several minutes, Clara remained at the kitchen table with Evelyn's ledger open beneath her hands. Finn slept beside the stove while wind pushed loose snow against the cabin windows. The paragraph Evelyn had written after Black Pine recovered was short, but Clara read it repeatedly. Evelyn had received offers to sell the ranch once its debts were manageable. She had refused them, not because she believed Black Pine must remain a working sheep ranch forever, but because of what surviving had taught her. A place that looked finished could become useful again if someone was given the chance to choose what came next. Clara traced the faded handwriting. Evelyn had written that Black Pine should remain available within the family through a symbolic transfer rather than become another property sold simply because no one currently needed it. The amount listed beside the arrangement was unmistakable. $10? Clara leaned back. "You planned it." Finn opened one eye. "Long before me." The realization changed the transfer completely. Clara had imagined Evelyn creating the option specifically as a rescue for her 19-year-old granddaughter. Instead, the idea had begun decades earlier, after Evelyn nearly watched Black Pine disappear. Years later, she had chosen Clara as the person who would receive that choice. Cole arrived after sunrise to help inspect storm damage. Together they walked the barn and fences. Several boards had loosened. Snow had accumulated heavily along the western enclosure, and part of the barn roof needed attention before another major storm. The sheep were safe, but Clara's growing repair list covered almost an entire notebook page. "That roof won't last another winter without work," Cole said. "Not cheap work." Clara looked toward the cabin. "Neither is everything else." "No." He did not soften the answer. That afternoon, Margaret came to review the final ledger pages. Clara showed her Evelyn's paragraph and the reference to the symbolic transfer. Margaret read slowly. This sounds like her. She wanted someone to keep Black Pine. Read it again. Clara frowned. I did. Then show me where Evelyn says you have to keep it. Clara looked down. There was no command. Evelyn wrote about preserving the opportunity to choose. She did not demand that whoever received Black Pine operate it forever. She gave me an option. Clara said, Exactly. The thought unsettled her more than an obligation would have. If Evelyn had commanded her to save Black Pine, Clara could simply obey. Choice required something harder, deciding what she actually wanted. She walked the property alone that evening, Finn trotting beside her. The ranch looked especially fragile after the storm. Snow covered damaged fencing. The barn needed repairs. The cabin was warmer than when she arrived, but drafts still entered around 2 windows. Feed costs would continue. The sheep needed daily care. Wolves remained part of the landscape beyond the fence. Clara had little money and no illusion anymore that $10 represented the real cost of owning Black Pine. At the north fence, she stopped beside one of Evelyn's blue-marked posts. She remembered Robert telling her she could not afford to run a ranch. She had wanted Black Pine to prove him wrong, but keeping a property solely to defeat Robert would still mean allowing someone else's judgment to control her decision. Finn pushed his nose into her glove. What do I want? She whispered. He offered no answer. Back inside, Clara spread Evelyn's photographs across the table. One showed the terrible winter. Another showed neighbors repairing the barn. Another showed Evelyn smiling beside sheep after the ranch recovered. Clara finally understood why Evelyn's note from the funeral had not said, "Save Black Pine." It had said, "Black Pine is yours to decide." The distinction made Clara's throat tighten. Evelyn had known what Clara's relatives sometimes failed to understand. Love did not require controlling someone's answer. The following morning, Clara called Margaret. If I decided I couldn't keep Black Pine, would the records suggest Grandma thought I failed? Margaret answered without hesitation, no. Even after everything she sacrificed, her sacrifice was her choice, Clara. Turning it into your obligation would defeat the point. After the call, Clara stood on the porch watching Finn move through the snow. For the first time since the funeral, she allowed herself to imagine selling Black Pine. She could leave Montana, find steady work, rent somewhere warm. No sheep, broken fences, frozen mornings, or wolves beyond the timber. Nothing in Evelyn's ledger forbade it. Nothing in her note demanded repayment. Clara had spent days believing Black Pine was the one thing her family could not take from her. Now she understood something more frightening and more freeing. She was not trapped here by gratitude either. Black Pine truly belonged to her, which meant she had the right to walk away. And for the first time, Clara had to decide whether she actually wanted to stay. Margaret arrived at Black Pine just after noon, carrying a folder thick enough that Clara knew the search was finished. Snow had hardened along the pasture edges, and Finn followed them into the cabin before settling beside the stove. Clara cleared the table and placed Evelyn's ledger, the photographs from the shed, and the cooperative copies beside Margaret's folder. This is everything I could verify, Margaret said. She began with the winter Black Pine nearly failed. The numbers were brutal when arranged in order. Sheep losses reduced income, feed prices climbed. A banknote came due while the ranch account held nowhere near enough to cover it. Evelyn's bookkeeping wages helped, but they were not enough. Then came the sale of her privately inherited property. The proceeds matched the emergency payment recorded in the ledger. After that, other documents showed Evelyn reorganizing feed expenses, negotiating shared transport, and coordinating delayed costs with nearby ranchers. Photographs confirmed those neighbors had also brought hay, labor, and repair materials. So Grandma really did save it, Clara said. Margaret nodded. She did, but not in the way families usually tell these stories. Meaning she didn't ride in alone and fix everything. She used her own money when the ranch needed it most, then made sure everyone who could help had a role. Clara looked at the image of young Evelyn standing outside the Silver Creek bank. For years, the family story had reduced her to the woman who kept the books while others handled the crisis. The records showed the opposite. The books were part of the rescue, so was Evelyn's inheritance, so was the network she organized around Black Pine. Why did nobody remember it that way? Clara asked. Margaret closed the folder. Because stories get simplified, especially when the work is quiet. Tires sounded outside before Clara could answer. Robert's truck stopped near the cabin. Clara stiffened. Fenn lifted his head. Robert entered carrying gloves and a folded copy of the records Clara had mailed him 2 days earlier. He looked uncomfortable in a way Clara had rarely seen. "Margaret," he said with a nod. Then to Clara, "Can we talk?" Margaret gathered her things. "You have what you need." Clara walked outside with Robert. The cold was sharp enough that their breath hung between them. He glanced toward the sheep barn and the repaired fences. "You've done more here than I expected. That's not why you came." "No." Robert held up the photocopies. "I read everything, and," he looked toward the cabin, "I was wrong about Evelyn." Clara waited. "I always heard Granddad handled the bank and your grandmother kept the paperwork straight. That's what everyone said." Everyone was wrong. "Looks that way." Robert rubbed one hand over his jaw. "I'm not proud of how much I repeated without ever checking." Clara appreciated the admission but did not let it soften the other issue. "You also repeated that I was too young to have a say in selling Grandma's ranch." Robert exhaled. "We thought we were protecting you from a burden. By deciding for me, the property was losing money. Maybe selling it was the right financial decision." Robert looked surprised. Clara continued, "That was never the whole point. You were allowed to think keeping it was a bad idea. You weren't allowed to decide my answer for me." The words landed between them. Robert looked away toward the snow-covered pasture. "You're right." Clara had imagined this confrontation many times since the funeral. In most versions, Robert defended himself until she became angrier. Instead, his agreement left room for something harder than victory. "I don't know what I would have decided," Clara said. "Maybe I would have agreed to sell. Maybe not. I'll never know because you made sure I didn't get the choice. I'm sorry." It was simple and insufficient, but not meaningless. Clara nodded once. "I'm not ready to pretend that fixes it." "I know." They stood quietly until Finn trotted outside and pushed his nose against Clara's glove. Robert glanced at him. "Evelyn would have liked that you found the shed." "Finn found it. Then she would have liked him more." Clara almost smiled. After Robert left, she walked the ranch alone. The air had cleared, revealing the dark Montana mountains beyond the pasture. She stopped at the northern fence where wolf tracks had crossed days earlier. The repaired section still held. The barn roof still needed work. Feed still cost money. Black Pine remained difficult. Evelyn had once faced the same truth. She had chosen to save it. Now the choice belonged to Clara. She returned to the cabin and spread Evelyn's final note beside the ledger. Saving a place doesn't mean doing it alone. Then she looked at the $10 transfer paperwork. For the first time, she understood the full weight of what Evelyn had preserved. Not a command, not a debt Clara had to repay. A decision. Clara could sell Black Pine and walk away without betraying her grandmother. Or she could stay because she wanted the responsibility, the work, the uncertainty, and the life that came with it. Outside, Sheep moved slowly toward the barn as evening settled over the snow. Clara stood at the window and knew that before anything else changed, she had one choice left to make. Whether Black Pine was going to remain hers, Clara made her decision before sunrise. She stood in the barn doorway while Finn moved quietly among the sheep and watched pale morning lights spread across Black Pine. The ranch was still imperfect. The northern fence needed permanent reinforcement. Several barn boards needed replacing. Feed costs were not going away, and the cabin windows leaked cold air whenever the Montana wind turned east. None of that disappeared simply because Clara wanted to stay. That was exactly why the decision felt different. She was not choosing a fantasy. She was choosing the work. "We're keeping it," she told Finn. His tail thumped against a gate. Cole arrived later carrying his usual notebook of repairs. Clara met him beside the barn. "I'm not selling." He studied her for a moment. "Because of Evelyn?" "Because of me." Cole nodded. "Better reason." They sat at the cabin table and built a winter plan Clara could actually afford. Feed came first, then water, shelter, fencing, and predator precautions. The flock would remain small. Repairs would happen in stages. Clara would find seasonal and part-time work around Silver Creek instead of expecting Black Pine to support itself immediately. When she looked at the numbers, they frightened her. But fear no longer meant someone else should decide for her. "This is going to take years," she said. "Probably. You could pretend it'll be easy. You wouldn't believe me." True. Margaret helped with something Clara could accomplish immediately. They placed Evelyn's ledger, photographs, and original notes into protective storage, then made copies of the records documenting the winter Black Pine nearly failed. Clara gave a set to the local historical society. She wanted the next person who asked who had saved Black Pine to find Evelyn's name before family memory could simplify the story again. There was no hidden fortune inside the ledger. No forgotten account waiting to pay for a new roof. Evelyn had left evidence of money going away, not money waiting to be found. Somehow Clara valued that more. The records showed exactly what Black Pine had cost her grandmother and why saving it had mattered. A week later, Robert and Hannah drove out together. Clara saw boxes in the truck bed and immediately recognized several belongings from Evelyn's house. Hannah carried in a quilt, 2 framed photographs, and Evelyn's old kitchen clock. Robert brought a wooden box containing small tools and personal papers they had found while clearing the sold ranch. "These should have come to you earlier," Hannah said. Clara ran her fingers across the quilt Evelyn had kept on the back of her couch. "Thank you." Robert looked around the cabin. "So you decided I'm keeping Black Pine? All right. No warning, no lecture about her age, just acceptance." Hannah apologized for excluding Clara from the sale decision, and Robert repeated his own apology. Clara did not tell them everything was forgiven. It wasn't. "I appreciate you saying it," she told them, "but I need time." "You have it," Hannah said. "That was enough for now." Winter deepened. When the next serious storm appeared in the forecast, Clara did something that would once have embarrassed her. She called Cole before he called her. "I need help checking the north fence before the snow starts. I'll bring wire." 2 neighboring ranchers came as well after Cole mentioned the storm. Together, they checked fencing, moved hay, cleared the barn entrance, and prepared the sheep enclosure. Clara worked beside them without feeling that every helping hand reduced her ownership. When darkness came, Finn guided the last sheep through the gate. Far beyond the pasture, a wolf called from the timber. Another answered. Clara listened without panic. The wolves belonged to the landscape just as Winter did. Her responsibility was not to conquer either one. It was to manage her animals responsibly within them. The storm passed. The sheep remained safe by late winter. Black Pine still looked rough, but it no longer looked abandoned. The barn roof had been repaired in its worst places. The northern fence stood firm. Water stayed available. Clara had found part-time work around Silver Creek that helped cover feed and basic expenses. Some mornings she was exhausted before the day properly began. She stayed anyway. One afternoon she carried a framed photograph from the cabin toward the old shed. It was not Evelyn's funeral portrait. It was the photograph Finn had led her to on that first snowy afternoon. Young Evelyn standing at Black Pine beside a blue-painted fence post, smiling as though someone had caught her in the middle of work. Clara and Cole had repaired the shed roof enough to keep the weather out. Clara cleaned the shelves and stored copies of the ledger and photographs there, turning the forgotten building into a small record of Black Pine's history. She hung Evelyn's photograph above the old workbench. Finn sat beside her. "You found all this?" Clara said. He looked hopefully at her pocket. "And somehow you still only care whether I brought treats?" She gave him one. Standing there, Clara understood Evelyn differently than she had at the funeral. Her grandmother had not been strong because she never struggled. Black Pine had nearly been lost. Evelyn had run short of money, worked extra hours, sold something that belonged only to her, and asked neighbors for help. She had saved the ranch not through perfect independence, but by knowing what she wanted to preserve and accepting the help required to preserve it. Clara stepped outside. Evening sunlight stretched across the snow, and the sheep were beginning to move toward the barn. Months earlier, her family had sold the ranch where she grew up without allowing her a voice. Clara had believed losing the land was the deepest wound. It wasn't. The deeper wound had been discovering that people who loved her could still decide her future without asking what she wanted. Evelyn had understood that. She had not left Clara instructions demanding that Black Pine be saved forever. She had left an option worth $10 and a sentence that returned something more important than property. Black Pine is yours to decide. Clara looked across the ranch. She had chosen to keep it. Not because Robert doubted her. Not because she owed Evelyn. Not because selling would mean failure. She kept it because this difficult, cold, unfinished place had become a life she wanted to build. Finn moved ahead toward the barn, and Clara followed. The fences would need checking again tomorrow. There would be bills, storms, mistakes, and mornings when she needed to call someone for help. None of that frightened her the way it once had. Black Pine was no longer Evelyn's ranch waiting to be rescued, and it was not a refuge Clara clung to because she feared losing another home. It was hers not because she could control everything that happened to it, but because the choice to remain belonged to her. Clara watched Finn turn the sheep toward the barn as evening settled over the Montana mountains. For the first time since the funeral, she was not trying to hold on to something someone else had taken away. She was building what came next. Her ranch. Her decision.